Welcome to the Hessian Scrum podcast. I am Raphael Alecto, the editor of the Hessian Forum website, and today I bring you a very special guest. It's Paul Lemos from the bands Control Bleeding, Skin Chamber, and many others. So, Paul, thank you a lot for joining us today.
Raphael, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
How have you been doing lately with the pandemic and all these unusual circumstances?
It's a funny thing. The pandemic ravaged New York City. I mean, it just, so many people died from it. I've been working in a school, in a high school now without a break, not going remote or anything. So it's a strange thing. The pandemic hasn't really affected me personally that much. I mean, I haven't been working remotely. My girlfriend, she's been working remote now for a year and a half, and she's kind of been taken out of reality. But for me, I've been pretty much doing what I would normally do. Um, it's just kind of strange the protocols involved, and still masking up now. We're going into the third year of it, so it's starting to become a bit of a strain. But my life hasn't changed that radically, and I haven't been doing music for a couple of years actually before the pandemic, so it hasn't really altered my musical career at all.
Oh, that's very good. And speaking of the musical career, I would like to start from the very beginning. So, Control Bleeding is an extremely diverse band. You've touched on so many different genres and atmospheres and moods. I think this is one of the first things that people notice when they start delving into your discography. And I imagine that this probably reflects you being a sort of cultural omnivore, like trying to assimilate all sorts of different aesthetic realms. So can you talk a little bit about that, about your earliest experiences with music and music listening?
You're right. I mean, I would say a musical or cultural omnivore is a good description. I mean, I was always, going back to being, I don't know, as long as I can remember, an avid record collector. Just to kind of, music was always at the forefront of my interests. And when I was in college, I probably had about 20,000 albums, just vinyl all over the place. And that was always just a passion. And then moving from fan and obsessive music listener to actual participant, it was an interesting move for me. And of course, drawing on a lot of genres that I'm involved in and that I still listen to today. I guess that's all kind of absorbed into the music that we've done. So yeah, I think it's very much kind of a place where initially I think maybe imitating when you're young, kind of imitating your heroes and your influences, and then somehow you kind of come up with your own musical voice, still influenced by many artists that I've enjoyed, but I don't necessarily know the influences that are there. But when people say, "Oh yeah, that guitar sounds like early Carlos Santana," I'm saying, "What? I don't play like Carlos Santana." But yet, like Soul Sacrifice was a killer track. And so I think it all kind of it all kind of it works into the music I've done. And then I think moving away from that, I think it's just, kind of a lack of it, like poor attention, maybe a limited attention span that causes me to kind of move around as much as I do. I'm just not content staying with one thing. I find inspiration in something else, and I kind of want to experiment to move in that direction. And I'm not really thinking of audience expectation because I work for a living. I've never relied on people buying my records, so I don't have to play the game of trying to maintain a certain base audience, like a lot of artists that just kind of stay the course and kind of keep moving in a certain direction. For me, it's always been a personal kind of project where I can move in any direction I desire at any time. Um, but I think it all kind of comes from, being just such an avid record collector and music listener.
Okay, you touch on a very interesting point now, because indeed I imagine that for artists who don't rely on music for a living, that probably affords them quite a lot of artistic freedom. And some of the genres that you've tackled, such as industrial or noise music, they were later, some of those elements were later appropriated by more popular bands. And do you think that in the process, those bands kind of nurtured what was audacious and bold about the music?
Give me the question again. I'm not sure what you said. It was a little static. I didn't quite get the core of the question.
Sorry, I was talking about later bands that took some elements from some of the genres that you worked in, like industrial or noise. Bands who took that and made it more popular, more mainstream. Do you think that in the process they nurtured what was really bold and audacious about the music?
You mean neutralized it, kind of watered it down?
Yes, yes.
Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of like what we would have done. I mean, I'm sure that, Knees and Bones, maybe our first controlled bleeding album, so to speak, was maybe an attempt to, I don't know, capture the essence of certain things that we were inspired by. Maybe, some of what, people like Whitehouse and some of these artists were doing. And we wanted to kind of take that element and make it our own and make it stronger. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's so relative. I mean, I don't really listen to bands that maybe might have, that perhaps were influenced by us. I really might not even know who those bands are. Um, somebody might say, oh, well, Skin Chamber sounds like, kind of like a Swans Junior, and of course, I was taking a lot from Swans back in that period of Cop and those records that I was really influenced by, and kind of putting it into my own, creating my own place for those influences. So it's tough to say. It's so relative. I'm not sure. Like some bands, I'm sure, have taken some of the ideas we've maybe that we've initiated or that we've explored and neutralized them. But I don't know those bands. Like who might you be talking about? Can we get specific?
Well, I was mainly talking about for example, the more popular industrial metal bands, for example, that came to later. But I guess
See, I don't know many of them. Like who like what would one of them be?
For example, or industrial rock, like Nine Inch Nails, for
Oh, I
instance.
see. Okay, like because like I thought that Nine Inch Nails kind of took their whole thing from Ministry. You know what I mean? That whole guitar driven thing, and really, when it came to doing that kind of really hard guitar, kind of wax tracks kind of thing, it's a funny thing because I think bands like Ministry, Skinny Puppy took a lot from us in terms of like Knees and Bones and the early noise, when there was not really any industrial music in America. There was nothing kind of like power electronics in America. There wasn't any. So I think they were very influenced by that kind of sheer brutal. But then I think when we got on wax tracks, we started almost playing the game of trying to be more, kind of more maybe of a guitar band in that mainstream. So we were starting to play that game of, I thought, imitating. And that's when I think the music lost a little bit of its soul. I mean, I like those records. I'm proud of those records, but I don't know if those are particularly original records for us. So yeah, it's funny because I always thought that we kind of hopped on that kind of heavy industrial sound when we started moving into the wax tracks and Roadrunner period of our music.
Okay, so I sidetracked a bit because of this question about not having music for a living. But going back to what we were talking about, the early experiences with music and the influences, I would like to go back to the part about the passage from being a listener to a musician. You mentioned some heroes or that you wanted to imitate in the beginning, and indeed, a lot of artists, when they're asked, they usually say that this jump towards actually creating is motivated by sometimes an artist, sometimes a single album. Do you also have that? Like, were there some particular artists or albums that pushed you to actually being a musician?
I just think it was that obsession. And I think the first time I experimented with an electric guitar in somebody's garage, I just kind of felt that ridiculous sense of power. When you're a kid and you have no power over anything, you know what I mean? Your mother is on your ass, your teachers are on your ass. You got no power. Maybe you got power over the dog or your younger sibling. But I mean, just that ferocious volume from an electric guitar was thrilling for me. So it wasn't any particular album or it was just a love of, like, I mean, when I was young, because I'm 63 now, guitar players were kind of gods. you know. But I think in the early recordings that we were making, I would say myself as a guitar player, like really early before Knees and Bones, you know, when the first lineup of Controlled Bleeding was playing at like CBGB's, we were playing with, you know, with my buddy Brian Setzer's band. Do you know Brian Setzer from the Stray Cats?
Yeah, yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah, yeah, we were very tight when we were young. We went to school together, and so so when I was young, like I was trying to play stuff like John McLaughlin and Mahavishnu Orchestra, or maybe you know things like maybe some of Robert Fripp's things. So I think those were early guitar players that I was really kind of interested in, and then you know of course you start moving away, but still I'm sure that those influences ring true in my guitar playing.
Okay, those are indeed two very interesting examples you gave. I also really like both the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Robert Fripp. A while ago you mentioned the Knees and Bones album, and we were talking about this whole harsh texture. This brings me to another very interesting point, in my opinion, which is the fact that in one of the many phases of Controlled Bleeding, you started to really explore this method of composition, which is based on not exactly musical building blocks, like making music out of pure sound, out of pure noise. I'm interested about how did you start to get interested in this method?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think there was a radical awakening for me. It was a real period of epiphany because we were playing, you know, with a trio playing this, you know, just very, very fast driven instrumental guitar rock, kind of not so different from some of the things we did before we ended. The last record we did was a thing called Larval Lumps and Baby Bumps, and it was almost a return to that kind of same mentality. But I mean, initially, what we were doing was just trying to play so fast and, you know, just playing so quickly, you know, guitar, bass, drums, organ, this instrumental music that no one gave a shit about. I mean, no one was interested in it. Even the bar owners would leave. I mean, sometimes there'd be no audience at all for it. We're talking like, I don't know what year, maybe 1978, maybe something like that, 77, 78. We'd play these things, you know, at CBGBs and whatever. And and then somehow I was in a store and they had a bunch of just it was a distributor. It was a place that was distributing imports and getting samples of stuff. And I found the first Einstürzan Neubauten Collapse. And this was way, way before the band surfaced. This record on Zigzag. And I mean, listening to that, it really gave me a very different sense of the kind of thing that was possible, you know, kind of breaking out of convention. And I just discovered that, you know, that I had to go over that line of how fast you could play and how intensely you could play instrumental music into that complete kind of primal scream therapy. And so, but that was a real epiphany for me when I heard Collapse. And I got this, you know, this record. It was a gold covered thing with this little symbol on it, of course, that's become so famous, you know, since. And man, that first record just that blew my mind. So that was an awakening to me of how to, you know, work with pure sound and layering sound and going beyond, you know, the normal musical conventions. So that was a real beginning.
Well, that makes sense because indeed I think it was a very radical shift when bands started to experiment with that. Because of course, throughout the history of music, there's always revolutions and new conventions. But I think this starting to work with pure noise is a particularly transgressive one. Okay, and within this topic of the working from pure noise, there was also a phase of controlled bleeding where it wasn't just noise, but a very particularly harsh and extreme noise, like like the aforementioned knees and bones or distress signals. And I'm also interested about um, how did this come about? This interest in extremeness, and if this is somehow related to the cathartic effect, to the catharsis in music.
Well, I think living in New York and just like where I am, it's just always such a clusterfuck of people, just the intensity of day-to-day life. And sometimes I think at that particular age and that particular time, you know, that kind of level of venting just took form of, you know, that kind of sonic aggression was something that I and Chris Moriarty both kind of could tap into and use to our own effect. I mean, we were, I don't know, I mean, that I don't know how many years ago that was, but we were pretty young in making it. I don't know if I could genuinely make that now. So I think it was just something of the time and just the kind of tension of day-to-day life. And it was, like I've said before, just kind of a place to put all those poisons. And so but keying in on it, I started to find like-minded people that were doing some of these sonic experiments. And of course, you develop friendships like myself and a guy like William Bennett in Whitehouse, and the people in Coil, and Masami Akita in Japan. And there was just a whole group of people back at the time that I knew, and we were all kind of interacting and exchanging recordings and ideas. And so it's just kind of an exciting time. And I think you know we were certainly influenced by some of the people we were interacting with. So yeah, it was just kind of, I don't know, I don't remember how I happened upon that just extreme feel, but I was always looking for the most kind of extreme experience, the most kind of extreme sonic experience I could have. I mean, when I was younger, what were the extreme bands? There was White Light, White Heat, by the Velvet Underground. That was a really kind of intense record. I mean, early Stooges, early MC5, but I always wanted something that was just, that much harsher, that much more difficult. And so when I found something like Neubauten, perhaps, that satisfied me. But it was always that interest.
This makes me think of a pretty interesting question, which is the way you emphasized how there was something that was very specific about the time, about the age you had at the time. Since you're a teacher, so you have a privileged access to the world of teenagers. Do you think that, from what you observe, do you think that in today's world with all this digital technology and social media, do you think it would be more difficult for today's kids to come up with something like that, something as powerfully intense and cathartic as what you did in the 80s?
Well, I deal with kids that know nothing, it seems, about anything except the fodder that they're given on commercial venues. There's so much that they can access on the internet and so much material, but they just don't really know about it. I mean, most of the kids that I interact with, they know the latest hip hop artists. They're still listening to Taylor Swift, Harry Styles. I mean, kids that are 17 years old, it kind of blows my mind. I think, at least myself, I don't see the need among a lot of kids that I interact with for that level of aggression. I see a much kind of calmer, gentler generation of kids than the generation that I grew up with. So I don't know if they would be, if they would need that kind of outlet as much. Like I even talk to sometimes football coaches, high school football coaches, and they're upset because they said, we can't get the kids to hit. They want to hang out, they want to hug, but they don't want to hit. And I don't know if that's true in Portugal, but it seems that it's a much gentler generation of kids than what I was familiar with, because, and again, I teach in a private school, not because I want, that's just happened to be where the job was, but yeah, so the teenagers that I'm interacting with, I could never see them looking for that kind of extreme outlet. I mean, they don't share my temperament as a youth at all. I was just extremely hyperactive. But, again, like sometimes I'll go to see a band like Dillinger Escape Plan or whatever, you know what I mean? And kids that are attracted to those bands, absolutely. I mean, the outlet is more aggressive, more violent than anything I've ever seen. It's just of a different nature. Or a band like, Portal or, Impetuous Ritual. I mean, those bands just, they still kill me. I mean, when you start looking for the most extreme musical experience, they provide it. But my students, most of them, they have absolutely no interest or awareness of any of that music. So I don't find that so much it's prevalent among the teenagers that I interact with.
So I imagine that first-person shooters provide all the venting they need, the violent video games and all of that.
Yeah, well, that's probably where they are. You know what I mean? The violent video games, the carnage, they can go home and they can just, delve into a more violent place than we ever were able to do, you know. Um, that digital domain that I still know nothing about. So yeah, it's just a different means of venting, I guess.
Okay, so with all this talk of violence, I thought about now moving on to the more gentler, the face of controlled bleeding, so to speak. And when we're talking about those albums like Music from the Scourging Ground or Music for Gilded Chambers, I think also an element that will probably be one of the first to catch the listener's attention will be the vocals. Can you talk a little bit about the goal of the vocals, their role in the music? Because sometimes they seem, in many cases, in many songs they seem like more of a texture than anything else, more just a sound among many other sounds.
Well, Joe Papa was always, for many years, Joe Papa, the singer, we were friends, but it was so difficult to involve him in what I was doing, you know, because there wasn't a place for that voice. I'd known Joe before Knees and Bones. He came into the tail end of the lineup of Controlled Bleeding that really very few people ever heard, where it was a guitar, it was a keyboard, and we were trying to kind of commercialize our sound to bring some listeners to what we were doing back in, like, I don't know, maybe 1979 or whatever. And so we decided we get a vocalist involved. And so this guy, Joe Papa, comes in and he's doing a scat singing and he's into all of this kind of Zappa-esque, goofy, wailing and screaming. And, it's just so over the top that there was no real place for Joe Papa. And then when I embarked with Chris on much more aggressive music, when we started working with things like Knees and Bones and the Noise Experiments, Joe was, we knew Joey, but there was really no outlet for his voice. But I think after I exhausted my need to vent, and I could go backwards and start becoming a more musical individual again in a conventional way, like once we started working on records like Between Tides or Head Crack, and start to move out of the early noise, Joey came back into the fold because his talents, could kind of be absorbed in what I was doing. And so I was starting to embark on a more, I don't know, maybe a bit more ambient kind of music, or a little bit more ambient sound. And so the beauty of Joe's voice kind of fit well into that, but we weren't really writing words at the time. We were just doing kind of, hymnal vocals and maybe just textural vocals. As you said, it would be a bit of time before we'd actually work on writing words and developing songs. But so it was an evolution. So some of those early recordings with Joe, yeah, they're just the voice's texture, but still a present element. And it was always tough to get Joe to sing within our group. It was always really hard because Joey's perfect band would have been like doing Ian Gillan in Machine Head. If you've ever heard Highway Star or whatever, that's the kind of vocal he would have loved. He would have loved to have been in a band like that. So being in the group with me, that was not his ideal, but he had a voice that if you could tap into it, it was a really singularly beautiful voice. But it was always a challenge to work with Joe and to get him to that place where he would sing without going way over the top into that other realm.
I also imagine that when you, like you said, when you embarked on this journey, when you went back to more conventional music, I imagine that this was also accompanied by renewed musical influences. Like there probably was something being released at that time that started captivating you, something in the lines of ambient music, or maybe something like Death Can Dance. I think there are some similarities.
I don't ever remember being inspired by those bands, but Joe and we did share the love of certain progressive music. We were deep into bands like Henry Cow, and, he loved bands like Yes. We loved early King Crimson, Magma. I mean, just a lot of, Art Zoid, Universe Zero, that kind of prog. And that wasn't so much vocal music, but his background, he was deep into a lot of progressive music and maybe much more conventional prog than I was into. So I think that mutual interest, that's where Joe and I could meet, because he wasn't interested in the noise. He had no interest in most of what Chris and I did in Skin Chamber. He had no real interest in any of that, Joey, but he was deep, deep into prog. And so I think that my interest in his, we found that meeting place where I could do the things that I enjoyed sonically, and there was that kind of semi-progressive element. But yeah, bands like Dead Can Dance never really were groups that we particularly liked. So we weren't trying to create, we weren't attempting to create an ambient music. It's just we had to move in that direction if I was going to collaborate and find a common place with Joe, and I knew that there was a place that we could do something. And so, because we were friends, it seemed that we could move in that direction easier.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, because within progressive music and progressive rock, the bands you mentioned are I would say some of the more experimental, some of those that push a little further. So I can see why they were inspirations for you both. And so speaking of that, of the influences and the process of actually coming up with music, I know this is a very cliche question, but in the case of controlled bleeding, I think it makes sense, because when we ask an artist about the creative process, usually if it's a rock band or a metal band, they will usually say something like, we first come up with a riff or a certain melody. But with music, as experimental as controlled bleeding, the process really sounds mysterious for the listeners. So I'm curious about how does a song come about?
Well, Raphael, it depends on the period and the project.
Of course.
Like Knees and Bones and a lot of body samples, would be in a concrete basement, and would just turn everything up to, as high as it could go, and would just record everything live, and then would edit. So a lot of that was just, it was just taking the good parts and leaving the other stuff kind of on the floor. So it really depends. On the period, a lot of times with the more, maybe something that's maybe a little bit like some of the things we did in Headcrack, you start with a loop, maybe a slowed down guitar loop, where you get like a bass, a drum rhythm, and then you just slow it down, and then you start layering sound on it. So I mean, it can start with any element. Occasionally it would start with some kind of, just kind of keyboard loop, something quite simple. Other times, you're actually working out the rhythm part, and laying down the bass and drum part, kind of writing it out, not notation, but within your minds, and get the framework for the rhythmic part. So it really does depend. A lot of what we were doing most recently was just based on, bass loops, and we would lay down a series of bass guitar loops, and then we would just kind of jam on those, and find a place, a melodic place within those, and then the song would structure over a period of time. So I mean, the process would just vary, but a lot of times it does. It just starts with that basic loop, or that percussive, part, and then, trying to find a bass part that fits it. And a lot of times it'll start with the rhythm section, I would find.
So I think one of the most fascinating aspects of music, or of any kind of music, for me at least, is how it can, so to speak, how it can summon a certain environment, a certain world. So this visual aspect, I think we've all had that experience, of listening to some music and starting to visualize in our minds some scenarios, sometimes an epic narrative, like listening to Wagner and picturing a battle or something similar. Is this part of your intentions when making music? Do you think of a particular environment, a particular world that you try to bring about through the music?
Well, it's kind of interesting, because I think a lot of the music may be very filmic, because I've never focused so much on meaning of words as much as sound. Like I've always loved instrumental music, because it can kind of take me into whatever place. But I don't think it's so much a conscious attempt to create a certain image or a certain environment, but I think there's a feel to the piece. Like if you listen to a record like Poisoner, Poisoner is probably my favorite record that we made. and it's just
That's
two
interesting.
long pieces, and I think it just conjures a certain darkness that is as accurate. It was the most accurate depiction of kind of what was in my brain as far as feel, but I think it's always just a kind of feel that a piece takes on, but not a specific picture. I don't have a specific picture in mind, like, we want to create this, epic battle scene within sound. So it's not like I'm trying to create that image, but there's always a feel to the piece, and you kind of get a mental idea of where you want it to go, and what you come out with is just a rough approximation. For me, most of the time, it's only a little part of what I imagine. Most of the time, technically, I just can't make what I want to make.
Well, that's very interesting. So there is an idea, but it's more abstract than a specific image or a specific mood, basically.
Always, yeah, it's always in the abstract. There's so rarely a very specific kind of image that I'm trying to create through a piece of music. You know.
So basically, every listener, when he comes into contact with this abstract idea, he sort of filters it through his own sensibility, and so the images that he himself comes up are kind of his own version of this idea that you bring with the music.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that most instrumental music really does that. I mean, it's a subjective experience, just based on every listener, and the way people interpret lyrics or whatever. It's always going to be a kind of subjective experience listening to music.
Yeah, of course. It's also interesting that you mentioned The Poisoner as one of your favorites out of your discography, because I imagine that must be one of the albums from Control Bleeding, one of the least, how can I say, one of the least commercially appealing albums that you did.
Oh, I think it's very specialized. It's not a particularly accessible recording, and that was pretty much a solo record, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be for whatever reason. That recording just came out the way I wanted it. All the elements were right, and yeah, it was as focused and complete as I could make it. So yeah, that was the most um, vivid depiction of what was in my brain at the time.
Well, it's also an interesting coincidence, because I listened to that album precisely, The Poisoner, and since we were speaking a while ago about the methods of making music using pure noise and sound, and probably The Poisoner is the point in your career where you were at the most free form, at the least conventionally structured, right?
Oh yeah, probably.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the album came out exactly as you wanted, because do you think that the fact that it was so free form led to more freedom in terms of what you wanted to express and
Well, that
accurate?
was the beauty of it, that it's kind of like this reverberating kind of undulating thing. And so, the elements that you put in there, it's not like a structured instrumental piece where you can say, oh man, the key's all wrong here and he's all out of time and so forth. You can't judge it on that merit. It's kind of artistic, it's kind of painting with sound, and who's to say where the mistakes might have been, or what you're covering up, or what track shouldn't be in there. But the hardest part really was mixing it with manually, because I'd never had any ability to mix with automation. I mean, everything was on big reels of tape, and so there were tracks in there that I didn't want, but knowing where those tracks would come in and kind of getting them out, that was the hard part, to get the mix correct on a record like that, where you have all of these elements, and trying to kind of get the ebb and flow correctly. And I mean, probably I could have edited some of those pieces down a little bit. That's the one thing, when I listen to it, sometimes it gets a little boring to me, and I want to move it along. But yeah, that was a pretty accurate recording though. Yeah, that was about the most accurate recording I've made. But yeah, it's so much. I mean, it's much easier to do music like that than in some ways than really structured, kind of more composed music.
This leads me to another thought, which is if you felt so much freedom doing that album, if you feel that it was so accurate, when you are composing more conventionally composed music, do you sometimes feel that it's more like the filter between your idea and the actual music? Do you feel some sort of blocking, some difficulty in translating, basically?
Oh, it's always a battle. It is, because it's never easy for me. Some people that just have natural musical talent, technical talent, can articulate themselves maybe in any way they want. But for me, it's the technical part. It's that lack of technical ability that's always you know, that's kind of what I battle with. So I've always worked within my means, and when it's something I can't do, I try to get somebody else maybe involved that's a better musician or more musically capable than I am. So I think the trio of Chris, myself, and Joe, we worked well together because we all had our different talents and our different abilities within the band. But yeah, it's always a real struggle for me. I feel very limited most of the time doing conventional music.
Okay, so we've covered a few of the phases of your work, but like I said, it's really vast, so that it would be difficult to really cover all of it. But since you've already talked about the earlier Archer music, we talked about that transition with music from the Scourging Ground or Gilded Chambers. We've now talked about the Poisoner. So what about Skin Chamber? Like, can you talk a little bit about that project, what you wanted to achieve there?
It's funny with Skin Chamber because Chris and I were really, really excited about early grindcore. We started just playing really fast, short pieces, and we were doing this project called Fat Hacker, and it was much more like, like 30 seconds, 40-second things. I guess, like early Napalm Death. I mean, like when John Zorn was so excited that he had to get Naked City going. I mean, hearing that early Napalm Death stuff, just kind of wired him out. And I think we were just really excited at the time. And Chris always came from a background of playing, with punk bands and thrash bands. I mean, his beginnings were playing like Slayer covers in his basement, and they were playing circle jerk stuff and that. Whereas I wasn't so fond of that, so I wasn't so deeply into, playing hardcore. But his background, he was deep into like, Rain and Blood and some of those, early Dark Angel bands like that. So I think that his interest kind of infected me a little bit. And when we started listening to early Napalm Death and some of the grind stuff, we started experimenting together and very, very excited about it. And we started sending some of the demos that we were making just for the fuck of it. We would just start sending them around. And we just happened to send one to Roadrunner. And this guy, Monty Connor, he gets back to me. I mean, he calls me back and he's excited about this, but he kind of wants to talk to me about this project, which wasn't really even formed. And so, we were playing really fast, short songs. And Monty kind of was directing us and saying, think about the project and let it, maybe flesh it out a little bit more, what it could be. And he was trying to kind of get us to maybe just sit back and slow it down a little bit and work maybe on some of the germs that we'd presented to him, because what we had was a whole bunch of rough ideas. But I guess he could hear within the roughness of this thing that we sent him some potential for what Skin Chamber could have been. So, we did. We kind of listened to his ideas, and we started playing more. And over the course of months, we started working on some real demos. We kind of got serious with it once we had the spark of interest from a label like his. I mean, I had no sense that any real label, like any label of any size, would be interested in this material. It was just kind of a goof to send it to him. So it inspired me to give it, some real serious thought and some time and see exactly what the project could be. And so, kind of with a little bit of guidance from him, we found a place that made sense to us. And I mean, Chris and I, we both, we love Cop. We loved early Swan stuff, and we were friendly with the band in the early days, Swans in New York City. I mean, I knew Michael Gira for many years before they, became a big band. So we just kind of, thrived on that pulverizing rhythm. And we use that kind of as a base point for some of the things that we'd do within Skin Chamber, to kind of bring it more into a, what was the metal market at the time. And for Roadrunner, I just think it was kind of an interesting experiment in what they considered maybe like industrial or experimental, metal, and it's interesting, bands like, Godflesh and Scorn, they were kind of working in a similar place as we were. But I think we were all influenced by Swans. That early Swan stuff was, I think, the root of all those bands.
Yeah, that's a curious origin story because you mentioning that you were very inspired at the time by bands like Napalm Death, but the end product of Skin Chamber turned out very different,
Totally.
including those really slow, like agonizingly slow parts. And it's funny because, for example, Godflesh, which you mentioned, Justin Broderick worked on, he played on Napalm Death. But can you detail a little bit more how this alchemy, like how the project changed it and became what it became in the end?
Well, again, it's strange because it was just the two of us, so we kind of, we just were up in a room and just kind of working on ideas, and we just kind of got into these slow, harsh rhythms and piecing these kind of long, repetitive parts together, and it just kind of took on a life of its own. It just became that thing. So yeah, it went from Fat Hacker to that. But yeah, if you ever hear the Fat Hacker tracks, you can probably hear a few of them here and there on YouTube. It's a totally different beast than what Skin Chamber ended up being. And I'm not really sure exactly why it changed so much, but it just kind of morphed into that. And over time, yeah, the faster tracks sounded kind of silly to us. They sounded, like some of those faster tracks I would have liked to have left off Wound. They sound like they're a little bit out of place. And the demos were so much better than what ended up happening in the studio for those faster early tracks. I wish that I could locate the demos, but I have no idea where they are. But they were much more accurate than what we tried to when we tried to recreate those songs in full studio. It didn't work so well. But yeah, I don't know why, like, and how it. I don't know how it all slowed down, except that we just were just experimenting and kind of got into that rhythmic place that was comfortable.
And I also imagine that in the earlier phase, since we were talking about the interface between the idea and the end product, do you feel that the earlier phase of the band, like Fat Hacker, that this really extremely fast, this discharge, was it also liberating from a point of view of the player, of the musician?
Well, it was the most liberating thing that we had done since the early days with, Knees and Bones. It was just a different, means of doing it. Instead of, just, feedback and total noise, we could harness guitars and drums and instruments again and just kind of just go with pulverizing speed and, just scream our lungs out and just kind of let it all go. So it had that same spirit ultimately, but just different means.
Still about the inspirations. Well, you talked about the fact that the song starts with an idea and not an image. But even then, do you receive these ideas that you want to express? Do they receive any sort of inspiration from other mediums, from mediums other than music, like cinema or literature, or even real life, like real life experiences?
Well, I think real life experiences are always, not directly. I mean, we're not writing music, we're not writing words about real life experiences, but I think, like I said, just the wear and the tear of day-to-day life kind of is what maybe pushes us or pushed us to create in the first place. It was like that zone where you could just invest yourself and you could kind of dump the poisons of the day or whatever. So I mean, a lot of Skin Chamber and Fat Hacker and more aggressive controlled bleeding, I think, was very much spun by just the day-to-day life of living in New York and kind of the constant the constant conflict to go anywhere in such a condensed environment. So indirectly, I think our environment had a big, great bearing on it. Like when I listened to a band like Swans, a very early Sonic Youth, I mean, I'm hearing the sounds of New York City in those records.
Yeah.
To me, that's New York City back in the very early '80s. It just, and I think to some degree, our music may reflect just the place where we live. I'm sure if we lived in a more pastoral, beautiful environment, those records never would have existed.
Mhm.
So I do think it just reflected the tone of life at the time, and as did something like Scourging Grounds too, which were sad records that were invested with just a lot of personal pain. And I listen to those. In fact, sometimes that's a hard record to listen to because, reflecting on the time period. But I just think, yeah, that Chris and I, we had a relationship where just we could find that place of pure aggression. We could always just find that place of just raging aggression, and our collaboration succeeded in that way. Where Joe Papa and my collaboration was quite the opposite. It was a much more cerebral music that we could create something, maybe from deeper within our hearts and souls that found its way onto tape. So, it was now, it's a funny thing because Controlled Bleeding wasn't really a band so much as but two separate collaborative entities under that umbrella. Skin Chamber was Chris and my project. And that was something that just Joey, he couldn't absorb himself. He had no part of that. That wasn't his aesthetic.
Okay, so the main source is the immediate real life experience. But I find it interesting because
Well, you asked other influences. Cinema for me, definitely, going back to when I was, really young. I mean, I remember seeing Eraserhead for the first time in an empty theater when I was, really young, when it first kind of came out and was distributed. And I went back 3 or 4 nights in the winter to see it. And I was just sitting there pretty much by myself watching this unfold. And it was just, that was a real epiphany in terms of imagery and just that complete industrial wasteland that Lynch created. That was a powerful experience. When I first saw Clockwork Orange when I was about 11, that was a powerful experience for me too. So I'm sure those cinematic worlds and some of those visions that I always loved in cinema, resonate somewhere in the music as well. Not so much literature and art, but definitely cinema.
Interesting because well, Eraserhead is also a personal favorite of mine, and I can definitely see the connection because Lynch really created also this very very addictive, very absorbing, I think, this world of desolate, like post-apocalyptic nightmare landscapes. I think that's, and I can definitely see why a lot of bands at that time would get inspired by that, because it really is a very radical vision that I imagine that it was the first time anything like that appeared on cinema. And as for
yeah, I mean, when it first came out, I mean, what year are we talking?
1977.
I mean, it was a singular kind of experience, on a big screen. And of course, who knew about it? It was just an empty theater. And then later, some years later, when Lynch kind of broke, it became a cult film, and, it would be packed and kids would be smoking dope and laughing at it. And I hated that because for me, it was going into this dream world and just kind of entering this deep, deep pit of someone's, absolute despair. And it was just that visual image of just the worst kind of depression that one could ever know. Yeah, it was a real awakening when I first saw it.
I think it's important that you mentioned the dream aspect, because another way in which I think Lynch was influential was not just the imagery and the emotions, but also the method. The fact that I think he was also a pioneer and innovator in the sense of making this really almost immediate connection between the unconscious and the screen. And I imagine that was also a breakthrough for cinema, because people at that time were probably more accustomed to conventional narratives. So I think this also probably mirrors in music the passage from more conventional composition to the more experimental and radical stuff, like, for example, like Knees and Bones, as we were talking about.
And I think Lynch was really kind of a Dadaist, going back to his early works, you can see that Dada component. It almost reminds you of stuff that was maybe, that guys like Dali and stuff in their beginnings were doing. So he was deep into the Dadaist and Surrealist. And I think no question that influenced a lot of what I do. I think indirectly, just that feel, that kind of other realm that you can develop sonically.
Oh, it's very nice that you mentioned that, because I was also thinking, and especially since you're a literature teacher, so you have you're connected with the world of the art history. So now that you speak of Dada, do you see your bands as contextualized in the history of art? Like, do you see yourself as a Dada artist or a futurist artist?
Oh, no, I don't. Not at all. No, I've never seen that. I mean, it's just an outgrowth of what I do most times, most days I don't even remember that I'm a musician. You know, I'm just a school teacher, so I never do. You know.
But you probably recognize some influence from those movements.
Well, I recognize the influence from, you know, since I was a child, you know, really, I'm not child, but since I was like in probably 8th grade, you know, I was very interested in Dada. I'd read John Cage's Silence. I was aware of Cage's records, you know, and these experiments with sound, that sound and music are the same, you know, and I think John Cage, his ideas resonated. They always fascinated me as I was getting, when I was young, and you know, listening to the early work of people like George Crumb, and then later little Penderecki. When I heard Penderecki in The Shining, or Ligeti, you know, these classical composers and the work that they were doing in the 50s and 60s, that just absolutely blew my mind. And to me now, it's sad that Penderecki, people hear this, you know, horror music imitation, and they think, you know, oh, you know, they don't know the
It's the other way
incredible
around.
intensity of, you know, like the innovation. So, you know, again, and that part of classical music and sound, that sonic world, had a deep effect on what I would try and actualize. Even if you listen in some of the Poisoner, on the first piece, where it kind of climaxes at around, I don't know, like 15 minutes in, that's a very Penderecki kind of feel for me. I was trying hard to get that kind of claustrophobic madness that develops in some of his work. So yeah, as an early influence, I mean, he was massive for me. You know, now like many death metal kids are listening to Penderecki. It's so strange.
Yeah, and I can also identify with that because you spoke about Ligeti as well, and I still remember when I first watched 2001: A Space Odyssey, and when the music comes in, it really is. I think everyone who watches that will get deeply touched by that. Will get really like mind blown, like you said. That was my introduction to Ligeti, and Penderecki. I think was Penderecki. I mean, I think was a little bit later, and but yeah, and it's funny that you bring that up, because I think also when listening to Controlled Bleeding, I can also see this association with the more avant-garde classical music, which seems to go for more like absolute emotions, like really intensified to the max. Like I think
Yeah, see, like Dead Can Dance and that kind of thing was never the thing that we were interested in. It was much more those academic composers, you know. But I mean, how, you know, when you listen to that music, you almost just don't want to do anything on your own. You say, what's the point? You know, they've just done it all. Like who comes close to that kind of genius? You know, I mean, those guys are just in a whole other realm. They really are. I mean, that's genius. But yeah, I mean, like whatever attempts we've made at sound are so pale compared to the greats, you know. So when somebody says, oh, you know, your work is so unique or whatever, it's original, or you're an innovator, I say, well, we're not really the innovators. It's other people that we steal ideas from that are the innovators. You know, we're just the imitators.
yeah, I just remembered also since we were talking about Lynch, Eraserhead, he also on the latest season of Twin Peaks, he also used Penderecki, the Ternoti to the victims of Hiroshima. Not sure if you saw that.
Was that in the brilliant episode? Was it 8, the black and white episode? There was one episode in Twin Peaks in the new version that was just brilliant. It was kind of an episode unto itself, and it was genius.
Yes. In the atomic bomb part was when he
Yeah,
inserted the song, the music.
yeah, I do remember. Yeah, but I mean, Lynch, like his use again of sound and music and just industrial sound and hums and that crackling electric, like the bulbs. You know, he just, I mean, he always, you know, he was, the soundtracks was just purely fused with the images. I mean, he was brilliant. And a guy like again, like a guy that, you know, image and sound is always like etched in my brain, as a guy like some of Martin Scorsese's films, you know, even something like Goodfellas, where the music and the film become one, you know. And guys like Lynch, Scorsese, yeah, that those moments where music and images, you know, fuse are just so effective. So cinema definitely has affected the music, no question.
I was also thinking, since you said that literature not so much, and since you are yourself a literature teacher, because we're talking about music and cinema that is very expressive, very rough in a sense. Is your appreciation of literature, is it more, so to speak, more cerebral, more meditative? Is that why you don't, it doesn't influence your music so much?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I mean, being a literature teacher, being an English teacher was just something that I happened to do. It's not that I have any great love of English or literature. It's something that I do. You know what I mean? And sometimes when people say, "Oh, you're an English teacher, you must love reading, you must, devour everything that has to do with words." And I say, "No, no, not at all. It's always about music and about sound for me." So, I mean, there are stories that really just, cut to my heart. It's, a simple story like of Mice and Men is one of the great stories I've ever read in my life, so, I'm not deep into, complex work. I mean, like I don't have to, uh, I'm not studying the works of Dostoevsky with high school kids. My knowledge of literature is pretty basic, compared to a lot of people. Um, I'm anything but erudite. Most things for me work on a real gut level. Like, I mean, some of, my favorite music, I love Penderecki and bands like Henry Cow and Magma, but my favorite record of all time has got to be the Stooges Funhouse. I mean, that to me is the great record of all time. That's the one that I would take with me, no matter where I'd go. So, most of the things I like are pretty primal, and they function pretty much on an intuitive basis.
Okay, so since we're talking so much about music, about other musicians, do you keep up with music? Do you still are you attentive to newer records, new artists?
Well, it's a strange thing that with the internet, there's such a barrage, constant flood of music, and yet I'm not able to find out about a lot of new music that maybe I'd enjoy, because it's just not the same with the whole record store culture and all of the, record stores that were open downtown in New York and people that you knew that were always kind of feeding you some advice or whatever. So it's really hard for me to find, to find stuff that I'm excited about. I mean, I like some of the work, I guess you'd consider it the metal genre. I think the more exciting bands like Portal, Impetuous Ritual, some of those groups I think are pretty interesting. I find myself enjoying that. But as far as other broader music, I'm not that well attuned to what's going on. And same with cinema. Reviews and what's going on in the city, I just don't access it. I don't want to access the stuff digitally too much. So it's kind of like it's such a barrage of material digitally, but I don't really enjoy that format, so I don't explore, and I don't really know, deeply what's going on in terms of new music right now. So I think I feel kind of out of the loop.
Well, yeah, well, your comments about like the current ways of discovering music, I think they're accurate because it's such a massive overstimulation that people get lost and it start to have a filter. And I think it's interesting because this probably feeds back into an earlier question, which is why the kids nowadays, including the ones you interact with, why they don't really feel the impetus to make music, to make passionate music like the early controlled bleeding records.
I think what happened too is the disposability of the way it's listened to. It's like if you have an experience with big speakers, a real stereo, and the music is hitting you powerfully, and that bass, you can feel it in your gut, but I mean, kids, they're listening to songs on their phones, they're listening on little, earbuds and so forth. It's just become kind of a disposable entity. I really do like the concept of listening to an album. Kids listen to songs. Oh, I heard you on Spotify, you're on Pandora, but there's no sense of the journey from the beginning of the record to the end, and the thing that you work to create, this kind of sonic journey within 8 or 10 songs. So I just think the whole process and the way it's listened to and consumed, just it all affects it. And I don't know if they have the same sensibility as somebody like I do when it comes to what you want to create and what you want to say through it. I think there's a lot of kids that are creating their own beats and doing a lot of hip hop production, again, stuff that is familiar to them. And you've got a lot of, kids that are writing lyrics, but I don't know if they're exploring those experimental depths maybe, or, I don't know if they'd be inspired to, or how they'd find that inspiration. Yeah, I think exactly what you said, the barrage of digital media, it almost nullifies your ability to focus on any particular thing. It's just there's so much stuff, and I find it's just cheapen the listening experience. Like, I don't really want to listen to stuff on SoundCloud. I don't really want to listen to, if it's not on a hard copy, I don't really want to. I'm still deep. I like my CDs, don't like vinyl. Everybody's back to vinyl, but once I sold 20,000 records off, I never looked back. But I like the hard copy. So I do. I wish I could find some place where I could discover really interesting new music, but I'm just not finding. I'm not making many discoveries. Now tell me, give me a recommendation, something that has really hit you, that you think is really something new, that you think is really good.
Well, my experience is similar to yours, in terms of finding new stuff that really gets me. But I don't know, I mean, there are exceptions, I would say. But I guess right now I'm not really getting anything, immediate. But
it's very hard to think of them when you have to, when you're under pressure. It's tough to think of them. But if you do, if you think of something, I'd love to know.
Okay.
I always try to keep my ear to the ground, but I don't get too much,
Yeah, and but I really see that as well when we're talking about the kids nowadays. I really see, because music listening, it seems to me that it has become a really, really passive experience. It's like when they're listening with their earphones on the phones, it's almost like it's like injecting dopamine, like a very mechanical, like almost like chemical injection, very mechanical process. So the passion and the actual involvement, and like you said, for example, the narrative involvement of listening to an album from beginning to end and seeing the whole story, so to speak, that's being built, that really is being it's almost fossilized nowadays. I would say it's really something that we're losing.
Oh, I think definitely. I mean, I think there are some kids that are tuned. It's funny how many kids are so influenced by their father's record collection. That's the weird thing when you ask them of their musical taste. And I'm listening to the Doors and Led Zeppelin and AC/DC. And yeah, they go to their parents' record collections and are digging around. But yeah, generally though, it's kind of like oftentimes kids will, ask me if I like a song, and they'll just be playing it on their phone. And I'm trying to, how are you supposed to differentiate the sound on a cell phone? But to them, that's just over the course of the day, the way they're listening. So yeah, it's a whole other world. I start to sound like an old person. You can tell, like when you don't really understand the world anymore, like your parents, right? At some point, they don't like the world anymore. I like the world, but I don't necessarily understand it.
Okay, and so speaking of this, not really speaking about the modern state of music listening, what about the music industry? Do you have any comments to make about the modern music industry?
Raphael, I haven't really been that active in the modern music industry, but I pretty much despise it. I mean, it's just, I just threw the towel in about a year and a half, 2 years ago. I just stopped. We spent about 4 months in rehearsal for a big festival called Days of Darkness, playing with bands like the Blue Oyster Cult and Alcest and Earth, and big stage. And our goal was maybe to start playing the European festivals. And we were doing some really difficult, interesting music, but I just despise the schmoozing, having to schmooze with journalists and people that provide opportunity, and just the whole business of networking and so forth. I just can't stomach. I mean, if I had a record label that really kind of gave me some support and whatever, but that whole infrastructure is gone. The idea of labels actually providing some support, some advance for projects, some support for equipment. So it's just, yeah, the music business is, it seems like there's not much reward to be had. There's not much incentive to kind of keep moving forward. And so, yeah, it became too frustrating dealing with the business end of it. I just found, you make these records, then of course there's no money that you see, because all the royalties are recouped for expenses. And, so it's kind of like, you feel that you're just always treading water and never moving anywhere. So yeah, I just got too frustrated with it and said, screw it, not doing it anymore.
Oh, I see. And well, without trying to activate some PTSD memories, do you have any particularly bad experiences with labels, with the industry in the past?
Well, I had really shitty experience with Roadrunner. Roadrunner was one of those labels when they were doing Skin Chamber and Control Bleeding. They were just taking bands, grabbing as many bands as they could, and throwing everything against the wall and seeing what would stick, you know? And what stuck? Fear Factory stuck. What's the band that wears the mask? Slipknot stuck. You know what I mean? Those were huge money bands for Roadrunner. But they just took as many bands like Skin Chamber and whatever, and they just threw it against the wall to see what could make them the fast profit. And if you didn't make profit on one, they'd maybe give you a second record, then you were cut. They'd give you an option, like they'd have to have an option for 7 records. So they'd have you buy the balls. But you know, they were really, I thought, terribly destructive to bands. And I know, like when Control Bleeding signed with them, you know, they were telling us how good the record was doing, especially, you know, how it was doing so well with the limited money they invested in it. And then they pulled the plug on the band, you know, and they pulled the plug when we started to really gain some serious momentum and were really excited about getting out, performing live in a wider, you know, a wider kind of, I don't know, a bigger tour, you know, something that we'd never really done. So yeah, I mean, I just found that that was really just bad for bands, a label like that, you know. And actually it was a gift to me because it allowed me to retreat back to doing more experimental music, the music that I kind of really enjoyed. I mean, it was interesting doing Skin Chamber with them and, you know, having a lot of money invested in the productions, but it didn't necessarily make me very happy in what resulted, you know. So it was a gift in some ways. It forced me to go back and rethink why I was doing music in the first place.
Now that you mentioned the live dimension, the concerts and all of that, it's funny because we've been underlining the cathartic dimension of the music throughout this. So do you think that can you talk about the live concerts, for example? Because I think that for this type of music, Skin Chamber, for example, I think it's precisely the type of music that makes sense to be played live, you know, to provide a really intense purgative experience.
Well, had we been able to actually get our shit together and maintain a live band with like 5 or 6 people to play the parts, you know, we might have been able to do it. But the problem is that we were just such fuck ups that, you know, we played one show at Limelight and, you know, we had to play with backing tape and whatever. And we couldn't duplicate the studio music. We just couldn't duplicate it. You know, it was just too difficult to do it. But I mean, had we been able to do it, it would have been great. We probably would have been able to stay with Roadrunner and, you know, maybe make something of that project. But it was really very much a studio project. Yeah, Skin Chamber was just too difficult to translate live. And again, like I said, you know, I just don't think that we were guys that were going to invest the kind of money and kind of time that you would need to present a proper live show. You know, we could do it in a studio, but we didn't have ourselves together enough to do it live. The most intense music live that we've ever done in my life was the music that we worked on just before the band broke up. I recently got a live recording of the last show we did, and you know, we were starting to work on these very long kind of building instrumental pieces. And man, I mean, the intensity level of that music was just way beyond Skin Chamber or anything that really I've done live. Um, and I'm hoping that maybe we'll issue that as some kind of like live bootleg, you know, at some point if we can clean the recording up enough. I think you would like that. Yeah, I'll send you the tracks.
Oh, well, thank you a lot.
I think you enjoy this.
Yeah, I think so as well. But you know, whatever you did get to do with Skin Chamber and with your other project live, did you enjoy it?
Some of it, you know, I always liked being a guitar player on stage, so I never liked having to play the game of being a keyboardist or doing other things that weren't in my comfort zone. And so often the music it didn't require guitar. So the most fun I've had playing live was really recently in the band that we rehearsed, you know, like I said before we broke up. But I would say the lineup that we had just about a year and a half ago, that was really demanding and great fun playing live. That was the most enjoyable time I've ever had playing live. And going way back to like those days of, you know, playing live at CBGB's as a guitar player, those were fun days. But all that in between, like trying to play more choreographed music, playing stuff like maybe Scourging Grounds and stuff like that, it was not, for me, that was studio music. That wasn't music to be presented in a live setting, just because it was out of my ability range. You know, I'm comfortable playing guitar live. You know, if I can play guitar, I can play bass, but having to create sound and try to recreate those sonic worlds, that's not something I could ever do live.
So you've previously already talked about how the behavior of labels and the workings of the industry played a part in you not playing music anymore. But are there any other reasons? Because another aspect of controlled bleeding is that it's really prolific. Like there's many albums, and sometimes in a very tight temporal span.
Well, we were prolific, way too prolific at a certain point,
Yeah.
you know, when just everything, you know, you're just so excited about recording and everything that you record seems to kind of appear. And the problem was that it was too much too quickly. Like sometimes quality control suffered, and I'd like to go back and maybe, you know, change that. But, you know, sometimes you just, you know, it's an impossibility. But then we became very unprolific, you know what I mean? Like it was years between Larval Lumps and the prior record, and we just like slowed down to a real crawl. I think as I became more and more of a perfectionist in what I wanted to do, you know, so we really hadn't been a prolific band, I wouldn't say, for a long time. I think that it pretty much stopped with, like, you know, probably right up to like Scourging Ground. But once we embarked on like Scourging Ground, Music for Gilded Chambers, and those records, we slowed way down, and we became much more involved in crafting the pieces. So yeah, but we had a hugely prolific period in like the early 80s, you know, from like 1980, I don't know, Knees and Bones, like 83 to like 86. Yeah, there was just a lot of records coming out, and it was just too much too soon. Yeah, it was just like this huge creative purge. And you know, some of it some of it I'm proud of still, and some of it just makes me shudder a little bit.
And speaking of that, like, what exactly would you, or what would you change if you could go back?
I would just edit myself, and I would mix more carefully, you know, because it was, you know, you're hearing a lot of records that were created in the process of learning, you know. So once I was able to reissue some of that on CD, I liked the CD versions better because I had much more of a grip technically on what I was doing. But sometimes, you know, just creating masters and how something might be, you know, just not sound the way it really should, or have that kind of crispness transferred onto record. You know, with album technology, just the albums never sounded particularly good. The CDs, I think, sounded a lot better. But I would just change it. I would not have released as much music, you know, and I would have been a lot more careful sometimes in the earlier days in terms of the quality control. Like an album like Between Tides, for instance, you know, that had some beautiful pieces on it, but there was a lot of work on it that just was incomplete. You know, it wasn't really an album, you know. And periodically there are records that feel like that I should have worked on more, and that just don't feel like they were, you know, ready to be released, that they could have been a lot more developed, a lot better, you know. I'd like to go back and fix the skin chamber and turn the drums down, you know, those big booming drums. I'd love to take that recording and, you know, just like remix the whole thing if I could. But you know, who knows where those tapes are. So there are a few things I'd redo.
So when you slowed down, do you think that you were getting better at this quality control, at doing things more thoroughly?
Absolutely, but sometimes you lose that spontaneity that makes really kind of exciting things happen
So it's
too. You know, that
double-edged sword,
spontaneity, this
basically.
creative burst, where, you know, sometimes you become too methodical and you lose that vitality. So it's interesting, but I think we regained that with the more recent music that we were doing, where it just had that kind of explosiveness, and that's what excited me about the more recent stuff that we did. But yeah, it maybe became methodical to the point where it became too much work to do it. It just started to take so much time and energy, you know, that I just maybe didn't want to invest it anymore. It just kind of wears you down after a point. I mean, I think I'll get back to some kind of creative work at some point, but you know, the problem for me too is that my old studio, I mean, I'm used to using analog tape, and my old studio is just, it's outmoded. You know what I mean? So I don't really have a studio of my own anymore. You know, I work in other people's studios, and I don't really have control of the music or the recording anymore. I'm kind of reliant on other people technically. And, you know, so I haven't learned to do my own recording again. You know, I don't know anything about digital recording. You know, I still know analog recording, which is kind of useless for me now. So part of it is just I don't have access to a studio whenever I want it.
I see, because well, it's curious because I think I was imagining that for someone who was done so much output throughout the years, you probably still have the instinct for creation. Like sometimes in your day-to-day life, I imagine some ideas might pop up sometimes, or just the impulse. Like if you had
You know,
them.
Raphael, being a teacher though, it wipes me out so much. It just kind of levels me that, you know, the end of the day, I have nothing really, you know. So having a creative life and doing the job that I do,
It
it's
empties you
not really
out.
compatible. Yeah. And like when I have time off in the summer or whatever, I want to be on my bicycle and do other things, be in the water. I don't want to be stuck in a studio, you know. So I don't know. I think just my wants are different. I don't need the outlet right now for whatever reason. But I'm figuring, you know, when I retire from the job and when I have more time to myself, then maybe the creative juices will come back. You know, and the other problem is once I get out of the rhythm of partnership, you know, when I'm working on a scheduled interaction or collaboration, then I'm great. You know, like what we were doing in the rehearsal for those performances that I mentioned to you. You know, we were just the creativity was rushing. But once you stop that rhythm and you get out of the schedule, then it's really hard to find my way back. So yeah, I'm in the dead zone right now.
Well, but I guess we've come full circle. Like we've arrived at the part about the future, the prospects about the future.
Mhm.
Just like you said, maybe you'll get back to the studio when you're retired. But yeah, I think well, coming to the future, and we have already covered, I think, some of the most essential and interesting aspects of your work across your several projects. So, would you like to say anything else about the band, music in general, the industry, as a closing note?
I think we've exhausted everything. I don't think there's anything else that anything that we haven't really covered, you know. But like I
That's
said,
good.
you know, I'm probably once I get going, if I'm starting to interact with my buddy Chad Bernhard, who's been my musical partner now for probably the past, I don't know, 6, 7 years, we've been pretty tight. If Chad and I get together again, I'm sure that the spark will ignite again, and that you know that musical dialogue will develop. It's just a matter of getting back to practice. I mean, I haven't picked up an instrument in a couple of years now, so I just feel really cold. But you know, I'm hoping that you know maybe there's something left. But when you hear the live tracks, you might say those need to be released. Yeah, those
Uh,
surprised me. I heard them just last week, and they surprised me.
well, that's something promising.
Yeah, so we'll
um,
see. Raphael, it was nice to talk to you.
yeah, well, once again, thank you a lot for your time.